What if a single road, a lifeline for goods and tourists, could be shut down, throwing entire industries into chaos? Sounds like something out of a geopolitical thriller, right? Well, it's happening right now between the United States and Canada. A simmering trade war between these two neighboring giants has just reached a boiling point, and it's not just about tariffs anymore. Canada is threatening to block a key route through British Columbia used by trucks and cruise ships headed to Alaska, putting Alaska's supply chain and tourism at risk. In this video, we'll break down why this is happening, what it could mean for businesses, and how Alaska could be impacted. Plus, we'll dive into whether this is a strategic bluff or a move that could truly change the relationship between the U.S. and Canada forever. Stay tuned to find out what's at stake and how this geopolitical conflict could affect you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with your thoughts on the situation. Let's dive in. To understand the current situation, we need to take a quick look at the events that have led to these tensions. The trade dispute between the United States and Canada has been escalating since early 2025. In February, President Donald Trump signed an executive order imposing 25% tariffs on all imports from Canada and Mexico, with an additional 10% tariff on Canadian energy products. These tariffs were part of a broader strategy that the Trump administration justified as necessary to combat illegal immigration and drug trafficking, specifically related to fentanyl crossing the U.S.-Canada border. In response, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced that Canada would retaliate by imposing 25% tariffs on U.S. goods, including products like orange juice, wine, spirits, motorcycles, apparel, and more. These tariffs amounted to around $30 billion. This action marked the start of a tit-for-tat exchange that would soon go beyond federal negotiations, involving individual provinces across Canada. As the federal government sparred, individual Canadian provinces began taking matters into their own hands. One of the most significant players in this ongoing conflict has been British Columbia, BC. In early March 2025, BC's Premier David Eby introduced a legislative proposal aimed at imposing tolls on U.S. commercial trucks traveling through British Columbia en route to Alaska. This move was designed to counteract U.S. trade measures and raise the stakes of the ongoing tariff conflict. Eby's proposal, known as the Economic Stabilization Tariff Response Act, would give the province the power to impose tolls on U.S. trucks. The tolls would specifically target commercial vehicles passing through British Columbia to Alaska. While the legislation did not immediately implement the tolls, it would provide the province with the option to impose them in response to ongoing U.S. tariffs. The legislation also raised the possibility of imposing fees on marine traffic through BC waters, potentially affecting ferries and cruise ships. Although it was clear that the tolls would primarily affect cargo transport, this proposed action has sent shockwaves through the business and tourism sectors, particularly in Alaska. So, what's the potential fallout for Alaska? Well, for one, the state relies heavily on the Alaska Highway, a key transportation corridor linking Alaska to the lower 48 states. Approximately 80% of the highway runs through Canada, making it a vital link for freight and travel. Additionally, Alaska's ferry system is closely tied to Canadian ports, particularly in British Columbia, for transporting people and goods. If tolls are introduced, Alaska's trucking industry could face a significant increase in transportation costs. This would affect everything from fresh produce to other essential goods, raising prices and creating supply chain disruptions. For businesses in Alaska, particularly small businesses, this could prove disastrous. The added cost burden may force companies to reduce services or reroute shipments, further increasing the cost of living for Alaskans. The situation is complex. While the trade dispute might seem like a matter of national politics, the reality on the ground in Alaska and British Columbia is that these economies are intricately linked. In fact, cross-border trade and tourism have flourished for decades, with Alaska's supply chains heavily reliant on Canadian highways and ferry systems. The Alaska Highway alone is crucial for goods transportation, including critical supplies like fresh food, medical equipment, and construction materials. In fact, fresh produce, one of Alaska's most vulnerable goods, is often transported via trucks through British Columbia, which would be directly impacted by tolls. If tolls are introduced, it would drive up costs significantly for these products, with consequences felt by consumers in Alaska's interior and remote communities. On top of the commercial implications, the tourism industry, both in Alaska and Canada, stands to lose. Each year, thousands of tourists, particularly those traveling by RV or bus, use the Alaska Highway to visit Alaska. If tolls are levied, the cost of this journey could rise sharply, potentially deterring visitors. Moreover, Alaska's cruise industry, which relies heavily on stops in Canadian ports, could see disruptions. If BC imposes tolls on commercial vehicles, it could raise the prospect of retaliation in the form of port restrictions or higher fees for cruise ships. The economic consequences of such disruptions would be felt deeply in Alaska's tourism sector, as the state is a top destination for cruise passengers. In fact, nearly 1.65 million cruise passengers visit Alaska each year, and even small shifts in cruise itineraries or restrictions on ports could have a significant economic impact. While the situation is already complex, it's also fraught with legal and logistical challenges. Certain portions of the Alaska Highway are covered by international agreements that prohibit tolls. This could create significant legal complications if British Columbia tries to move forward with this plan. Additionally, implementing toll infrastructure would require significant investment in new facilities such as toll booths and staffing, which could be complicated and time-consuming. For a province like BC, which already has its hands full with the economic fallout from tariffs, it might be difficult to navigate the logistics of enforcing such a proposal. Unsurprisingly, Alaska's leaders have reacted swiftly and strongly to BC's proposal. Governor Mike Dunleavy urged both countries to resolve the trade dispute at the federal level, cautioning against unilateral actions by provinces that could escalate tensions further. Dunleavy's stance reflects a desire to de-escalate the conflict and avoid harming long-standing relations between Alaska and British Columbia. Senator Dan Sullivan took a more combative approach. He warned that if BC moved forward with tolls, Alaska could retaliate by pushing for changes in U.S. laws governing Alaska's cruise industry, particularly the requirement for cruise ships to stop at Canadian ports. Sullivan's rhetoric signals a potential trade war over tourism, as he threatened to push for a waiver of the law that forces cruises to stop in Canada. If successful, this could significantly affect BC's coastal cities, which rely heavily on Alaska-bound cruise traffic for their tourism industry. Alaska's business community has also voiced concern, especially within the trucking industry, which represents a significant part of Alaska's economy. Jamie Benson, the executive director of the Alaska Trucking Association, warned that the introduction of tolls would lead to a sharp rise in transportation costs and could disrupt supply chains. He emphasized that these disruptions would impact Alaska's local businesses, which rely on timely deliveries of fresh goods and other critical supplies. As we've seen, this is not just a battle between two countries, but a conflict that impacts local communities, businesses, and industries that rely on smooth cross-border trade. The proposed tolls by British Columbia are a high-stakes negotiation tactic. Whether they are bluffing or ready to follow through with them remains to be seen. But the economic interdependence between Alaska and British Columbia underscores the risks of escalating trade wars that can have real-world consequences. For Alaska, the impact of this conflict could go beyond higher prices for goods and disruptions to critical supplies. It could also affect tourism, local businesses, and interstate relations, all of which could leave both parties worse off. In conclusion, the escalating trade tensions between the U.S. and Canada and British Columbia's proposed toll on U.S. commercial trucks have created an unprecedented situation that could harm both nations' economies. Whether this move by British Columbia is a genuine retaliation or a strategic bluff to force the U.S. to reconsider its tariffs is yet to be fully determined. However, the potential impacts, ranging from supply chain disruptions to tourism losses, highlight the need for careful diplomacy and resolution at the federal level to avoid more damage to the relationship between the two countries. We'll continue to monitor how this situation develops, but for now, it's clear that the stakes are incredibly high, and both sides need to carefully weigh the long-term consequences of their actions. Thank you for joining us in this detailed analysis. Be sure to like, subscribe, and comment below with your thoughts on this situation. Should Canada proceed with the tolls, or should both nations negotiate at a higher level? Let us know what you think. See you next time.
In history, Eby didn't just announce tolls on U.S. freight trucks passing through British Columbia. He declared defiance. He said, "We are doing all we can to detach from the U.S., to move to other markets, and to break free from the whims of one person in the White House." It was more than just symbolic. EB's move was calculated. It was a direct response to the tariffs imposed by Trump's administration on Canadian goods like aluminum and steel, industries that were vital to Canada's economy. The U.S. claimed these tariffs were in place to protect American jobs, but to Ottawa, they felt like an economic chokehold designed to make Canada dependent on American manufacturing. The U.S. wasn't the only target. British Columbia wasn't merely defending trade, it was setting the stage for a complete overhaul of Canada's economic strategy. David Eby's first step was strategic tolls on U.S. freight trucks. These trucks used British Columbia as a transit corridor to Alaska, saving time and money. By imposing fees on these shipments, Eby wasn't just raising revenue, he was applying pressure on the U.S. to show that Canada wasn't afraid to retaliate. This toll wasn't just about money, it was about sending a message. If the U.S. wants to play hardball, Canada can do the same. At the same time, British Columbia was putting in motion a much bigger plan, an economic resilience strategy aimed at reducing reliance on U.S. trade. The government introduced incentives for Canadian businesses to prioritize interprovincial trade instead of relying on American imports and exports. This wasn't just a temporary retaliation, it was a long-term structural shift to shield Canada from the unpredictability of American tariffs. But there was more to it. British Columbia also began to implement low-carbon fuel mandates that would require domestic sourcing of fuel, cutting out American suppliers almost entirely. This policy wasn't just about creating a sustainable future for Canada, it was a move to regain control over its economic destiny. And as these changes were taking place, the world was beginning to pay attention. While Canada was fortifying its economy, something much bigger was unfolding, a chain reaction triggered by uncertainty. Investors hate uncertainty, and Trump's trade war created plenty of it. His unpredictability one day imposing tariffs, the next threatening sanctions was throwing the financial world into chaos. But one sector was feeling the heat more than others: technology. For years, Silicon Valley thrived on a delicate balance of global supply chains. Companies like NVIDIA relied on international cooperation, sourcing materials from countries like China and Canada. But Trump's push for economic nationalism was threatening that system. In particular, NVIDIA, the world's biggest AI chipmaker, was about to lose more than just market share, it was about to lose $1 trillion. NVIDIA's downfall was set into motion by Trump's chip export restrictions aimed at slowing down China's AI development. With the stroke of a pen, the U.S. tightened the screws on China's access to advanced AI semiconductors, blocking companies like NVIDIA from selling their most powerful chips to Beijing. The goal was simple: stop China's AI progress. But the result was far from what the Trump administration expected. Instead of crippling China, the sanctions backfired, causing massive uncertainty in the tech sector. Investors began to panic as the U.S. was inadvertently cutting off not just China, but its own tech companies' access to critical markets and materials. The fear was real. If the U.S. was willing to cut off chip sales to China, what would stop China from cutting off the raw materials needed for these chips? NVIDIA was in trouble. The company, once valued at a staggering $3.66 trillion, began to plummet. On January 27th, NVIDIA lost $589 billion in a single day, a loss that shocked the entire tech world. But that wasn't the end. Over the next 2 months, NVIDIA's market value continued to slide, dropping by $1 trillion. As NVIDIA's stock tanked, it wasn't just a tech sector issue, it was a full-blown economic crisis. What started with a small retaliation over truck tolls in British Columbia had spiraled into a global market correction. Wall Street had seen market corrections before, but nothing on this scale. The irony here was striking. Trump's trade war wasn't supposed to hurt American companies, it was supposed to protect them. But now, the crown jewel of America's tech industry, the company leading the AI revolution, was on its knees. So, how did this small act of defiance by British Columbia connect to NVIDIA's downfall? The answer lies in globalization. NVIDIA had relied on a complex, interconnected supply chain. Taiwan's TSMC manufactured the most advanced AI chips. China provided critical raw materials, and Canada supplied vital components like nickel and aluminum for cooling systems. But as Canada retaliated, it sent a warning sign to the world. America's closest allies weren't standing by anymore, they were fighting back. As British Columbia imposed tolls, it became clear that other countries weren't going to sit idly by.